Motif versus theme versus moral. When we are looking at these three concepts, it's often easy to confuse or interchange these three ideas. The reality, though, is that there are three very different concepts. As you can see, a motif is a recurring image, word, phrase, or idea, even a represented object or an action, that tends to unify a literary work and can often be elaborated into a theme. I think in class I used the example of Romeo and Juliet. The motif, if you will, of Romeo and Juliet is the idea of lost love. Lost love isn't necessarily arguable, but it is an idea that is certainly kind of at the heart, centrally, to that particular Shakespearean tragic play. Now, we differentiate a motif from a theme because a theme is a central message or insight into human life that is revealed through a literary work. A theme must be arguable, whereas a motif is simply the idea. A theme allows you to take that idea and kind of mold it into a statement that can be argued, that can be analyzed, that can be defended, if you will. As I put down there, you have to be able to defend a theme with examples from the text. If you look at the motif of lost love in Romeo and Juliet, you can't necessarily defend that. Again, it's a concept. You can't argue lost love. Can you, for instance, take lost love and articulate that into a theme? Can you say, for instance, that there are times that love comes with consequences, that loving someone sometimes requires sacrifice? Those would be ideas thematically that you could draw out of the motif of lost love, and certainly that you could defend with evidence from the text in that play. Certainly the idea that love comes with sacrifice or consequences could be seen not only in the fact that Juliet's parents are upset that she's in love with Romeo, but in the fact that Romeo and Juliet end up sacrificing their own lives at the end because of their love for one another. So as you can see, you can take aspects of the text, specific textual support, to be used to back up that theme, which again is derived from the motif. Now we talked about motif and theme, but how does a moral fit in with all of this? Well, a moral is a lesson that's taught to us by a literary work in a very didactic or instructive kind of manner. If you think about it, you probably are familiar with certain fables. We talked about beast fables in class, and they often end with a moral that is usually stated. If you look at the most famous beast fable, perhaps The Tortoise and the Hare, the idea at the end is one that's almost become cliché. The moral is, slow and steady wins the race, certainly. Whereas the moral is the lesson that's taught to us, the theme simply shows us something about ourselves as human beings. That's the difference, certainly, between the two of those. That said, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the idea of symbolism, which sounds, certainly rather simplistic. I mean, you have probably seen the definition for symbolism, the idea that a symbol stands for itself and for something broader than itself, since middle school. And you probably know, based on both the pictures that are on the screen and based on the latter half of the explanation, that symbols can be objects, they can be people, they can be situations, they can even be actions that suggest wider meanings. I think the most obvious examples of symbols that we think about are symbols that can be objects. A cross, for instance, what I have listed up there, can be a symbol. A wedding ring can be a symbol. Certainly the American flag could be a symbol. But there are people who have or take on certain symbolic values as well. Take, for instance, the President of the United States. Why do we get so bent out of shape about who the president is? And, why do we get upset when the president does or does not do certain things? Well, it's because the president is a symbol of the country and its people. So certainly that office and the individual who occupies that office takes on a tremendously weighty symbolic value. The Pope would be an example of a symbol because though a person, he becomes the face of, the symbol for the Catholic Church. Even somebody like Mother Teresa or Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., all are people who are symbols, certainly, for everything from peace to the civil rights movement, as was mentioned in the case of Dr. Martin Luther King. That said, think about situations that are symbolic. A funeral certainly is a symbol in the fact that it represents a person's life, and certainly the life that they've led. The idea of a wedding certainly is a symbolic union between two people. Those would be situations that would be symbolic. And even actions certainly are symbolic. Whether you give somebody the thumbs up in Florida, in Nebraska, or in Seattle, Washington, the bottom line is people will know what that gesture, what that, if you will, action means, certainly. Now, when we talk about symbols, it's not simply the idea that a symbol is a symbol. There actually are a couple of different kinds of symbols that exist. The two kinds of symbols that exist are ones that we're both familiar with, although we tend to use one a whole lot more than the other. The first kind of symbol, if you will, is a conventional symbol. And conventional symbols have symbolic values that are widely recognized, certainly by society or by culture. Certain things, as I mentioned, a thumbs up, no matter where you go in the country, somebody will know what that means. If you flash somebody the peace sign, no matter where you are, likely they will understand that. If you have something like, again, the American flag, no matter where you go, people will know what that symbolizes. That said, those symbols are, again, ubiquitous. They're everywhere and they're widely recognized. But there's a second kind of symbol known as a literary contextual symbol, which is only a symbol within a certain context, within a certain idea or piece of literature. These kinds of symbols can be settings, characters, actions, objects, names, or other things in a literary work that suggest their little significance, but also certainly have a symbolic value within the context of that situation or piece. To give you an example, if I were to have a flagpole in the front of my house and I get a flag that has a bat on it and I raise it up that flagpole, somebody might look at that and go, oh wow, that individual is a big fan of Batman. Which, would probably be a symbol that my guess would be conventional. If you saw that bat, no matter where you are, you would probably go, oh yeah, okay, that person likes comic books. That person likes superheroes. But if I were to take that flag and I were to run it up that flagpole at about the halfway point in the month of October, you might look at that and say, well, you might not think that I was symbolizing Batman, but that I was instead a real fan of Halloween because of the time of year in which I had put up that particular flag. That would be a certain situation in which that symbol on the flag might be literary contextual as opposed to conventional. Put another way, if you looked at, for instance, the rainbow, if you were driving down the highway and you saw a rainbow on the back of someone's car, from a literary contextual standpoint, it might not mean much, but conventionally you would look at that and go, oh, that person is celebrating the gay rights movement, if you will, the rainbow having become a fairly ubiquitous symbol for that. But if I were to pull out the Holy Bible and find a rainbow in a certain situation, in a certain biblical story, within the context of that literary document, the rainbow symbolizes God's promise never to destroy the world again. So in that respect, certainly the rainbow would have a literary contextual symbolic value within that particular work of literature. So we talked about symbols, certainly, but I do want to kind of talk a little bit about characters as well. When we talk about characters in a work of fiction are generally designed to open up or explore certain aspects of the human experience. And because of that, characters generally have maybe one or two very dominant kinds of traits or characteristics. Even very well-developed characters tend to exhibit certain qualities that we have as human beings. If you look for certainly at the pictures that are on the slide, you might look at the top corner and look at Gandalf and think, oh, that character symbolizes a wise man, if you will. Timon and Pumbaa up in the other top corner certainly symbolize a carefree attitude, a fun kind of attitude toward life. If you look at the bottom corner at Daniel Craig as James Bond, certainly you would say that character is very smooth, very suave, very intelligent, cool under pressure. Those would be dominant characteristics or traits that particular fictional character would have. And certainly if you looked in the other bottom corner, The first thought that might come to mind as far as a characteristic of Anakin Skywalker, eventually Darth Vader, is that he is arrogant, certainly as Anakin Skywalker, and he is rather tortured, actually, as Darth Vader, as well as being rather emotionless and certainly very evil, if you will, because of his certain situation. When we're talking about characters, though, we can go into a little more depth, and we can talk about three different types of characters that actually exist. The first type of character is a flat character. It's a character that's very simple, very unchanging. We generally refer to these characters as static. They don't really go from good to evil or evil to good or and so on because they're not terribly well developed. A great example of a character like this might be Aunt May from the Spider-Man movies. Aunt May is there to serve kind of as Peter Parker's conscience, maybe a little bit of his guide, but really is not a terribly well-developed character beyond that within most Spider-Man comic books and films. We contrast a flat character with a much more round kind of character. These characters are very well developed. They often serve as protagonistic or antagonistic characters within works of fiction. They often are much more complex. They're less predictable. They don't have to be, but they can be rather dynamic, meaning they do change. This is Anakin Skywalker from the previous screen, who went from an innocent child to an arrogant man to a tortured soul as Darth Vader, and at the end of Return of the Jedi, kind of finds his moral center again, becomes good again, if you will, when saving his own son, which ultimately costs him his life. Another kind of round character might be someone like the character of Tess Durbeyfield, certainly within Tess of the D'Urbervilles, the novel by Thomas Hardy, where you have a woman who is very complex, fighting against a society which has pretty much indicted her and convicted her for a crime that really wasn't of her making at the end of the day. A very round, very complex kind of character. Then we have a third kind of character, which is a stock character. And the truth is, we know these characters because they're rather stereotyped kinds of characters. The name of the character might change, the appearance of the character might change, but if you strip those things away, at its core, this is the same kind of character presented over and over and over and over again. That said, I had given you a couple examples of some stock characters on the previous screen. Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, for instance, is a stock character. Because if you think about it, Gandalf is the wise old man that gives sage advice to other characters within the context of that literary work. You could take Gandalf, you could change him slightly, take him out of, for instance, Lord of the Rings, insert him into Harry Potter, and he would function not certainly as Gandalf, but as Dumbledore. You could take Gandalf out of Lord of the Rings, change him into a small green creature with long ears, put him in Star Wars, and he would become Yoda. You could take Gandalf out of Lord of the Rings, change him into a very large mutant rat, and stick him in the sewers of New York with a bunch of teenage mutant ninja turtles, and he would be Master Splinter. You could even take Gandalf and put him in a more realistic fictional situation, make him Japanese, and have him tutor and guide, mentor, if you will, a young Italian kid from the 80s movies Karate Kid, and he would be Mr. Miyagi. These are all different kind of versions of the same root stock character. Stock characters aren't just wise old sage characters. We certainly have the cowboy, who is a stock character, the one-man soldier who can fight against an entire opposing army or mob or something of that nature and manages to win, certainly played by everybody from Sylvester Stallone to Bruce Willis. You could have the lone cop who is one infraction away from being drummed off the force, usually has a drinking problem, but at the end of the day always gets his man. That's a stock kind of character. There are many different kinds of stock characters within our fiction that exist. Certainly those were but a few examples. Now, we talked about some different kinds of characters and certainly the dominant characteristics that they have, but we haven't yet talked about how those characters are developed, how they are characterized, if you will. Characterization is the personality that a character displays and the means by which an author reveals that personality. And there are two ways that characterization is revealed to us, certainly as readers. There is direct characterization and indirect characterization. Now, I like to start with indirect characterization first, because indirect characterization, in my opinion, is the more complex of the two, certainly. This is where we're not told directly what a character is like, but instead we're shown what the character is like based on the way the character speaks. If the character speaks in a very educated voice using a complex diction, we tend to think the character is rather educated. We get characterization indirectly through a character's thoughts. If a character is very nice to another character, and yet we get a little bit from the narrator's standpoint that the character is thinking of killing that other character, we believe pretty quickly that that character is conniving, is immoral, unethical, etc. The character's physical actions. Obviously, if a character picks up a car off of a street and hurls it out of the way of certainly an oncoming train, then we would look at that and say, oh, that character is obviously very physically strong and perhaps heroic based on the actions. And if a character is revealed based on what other characters think of that character, that too can help characterize an individual, a character, in our own minds. All of these things put together help us to kind of deduce what a character is, who a character is, what a character is like, certainly used more indirectly. Now, there are times whenever authors will use this method, but there's also times when brevity is more important, where an author needs to essentially establish very quickly, very efficiently, what a character is like. That's where more direct characterization comes into play. Direct characterization is where we are literally told what a character is like physically, emotionally, intelligence-wise, and so on. Obviously, it takes much less time to do this, and to be honest, oftentimes authors will use a combination of direct and indirect characterization, certainly when developing a character over the course of a work of fiction. So we talked about characterization, different kinds of characters and symbols and so on, but we haven't really scratched the surface of allegory yet, and I want to talk about allegory for a minute. Allegory is a narrative, a particular situation, in which the plot, the characters, the setting make a strong association with another very deep meaning, and it creates the link, it builds the bridge between the fiction and nonfiction situations or ideas within the real world. Thus, the work serves as one huge giant metaphor, kind of commenting on perhaps a real world idea, situation, concept, etc. Oftentimes, when allegories are created, elements within the allegories certainly beg that association and really want you to think about what ultimately they mean based on their connection with real life, with the real world. And that connection is further enhanced by oftentimes certain names like hope and pride, youth and charity being used certainly to help you make that connection, to make that association with that larger kind of nonfiction concept or idea. An example of an allegory might be something like the movie District 9, where certainly the premise for the film is that there are aliens that have crash landed on Earth. It just so happens they crash land in Johannesburg, South Africa, and they are sequestered off from the rest of the human population in ghettos that are fenced off, again, so that they cannot be anywhere near the human counterparts who have kind of sectioned them away. Obviously, if you take a look at this film, it's begging you to make the association between the fictional idea and the idea of apartheid, certainly where African native South Africans were sectioned off and placed in ghettos, certainly within Johannesburg, South Africa, back when apartheid was certainly a problem within that country. Another example might be something like the novel The Animal Farm, which obviously builds kind of a connection and association based on the way the pigs act within that particular book, between that idea or that novel and the idea of communism, and certainly the commentary on communism and how it functions, as outlined within that particular novel. So we talked about all these things, and I do want to mention or talk briefly about the idea of style, certainly before we're done. Style is made up of the way certain words, certain sentences, and so on, the way the writer arranges these things to achieve a particular effect, a particular idea. The two components that make up style essentially are diction, or word choice, and syntax, which is a writer's sentence structure. Now, when we're talking about style, you can't just talk about style unto itself. Style has a purpose. It has a means to an end. And that's the connection between style, tone, and mood. You see, style is used to effect a certain particular tone, which is really the attitude that a writer takes towards his or her subject, characters, and readers. The tone the tone of a work can often be described as formal or informal, playful, bitter, dark, anxious, etc., etc. That said, certainly the way that style is created helps to affect this certain tone, this certain attitude that a writer takes. Now, how do you differentiate between tone and mood, for instance? Well, tone is what the author intends. Mood is how the reader or watcher feels based on the tone that has been created. So if you have a really good horror film, for instance, the intent of the author, the tone that's being established, is one that is scary. The reality is, if it's good and it's effective, if it's well done, the mood that's created in the reader is that you feel afraid. So there's an association between tone and mood. I always like to give the example, though, that there can be a breakdown, certainly, between tone and mood. If you think of it, for instance, a horror film where you can clearly tell when watching the film that the author intended, the writer of the film intended it to be scary, but it was unconvincing. In fact, you not only did not find it scary, you found it funny. I would argue there's a disconnect there between tone and mood in that particular case. That said, certainly tone and mood are interconnected, even though they cannot be used interchangeably because they are two different concepts. That said, that takes us or brings us to the end of our second short fiction presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and as always, carpe diem.